Hi everyone, welcome to The Enthusiastic Buddhist. In this episode, I want to look at the practice of mindfulness. Right Mindfulness is included as one of the 8 trainings in the Noble Eightfold Path, which are the things we need to train in order to become enlightened. If you missed my episode on the Noble Eightfold Path, I'll put a link to it up here. Mindfulness even makes up the first of the 7 factors of enlightenment, which are mental qualities we need to cultivate in order to progress on the path of awakening. So the fact that it's included in both these trainings, the Noble Eightfold Path and the 7 factors of enlightenment, highlights just how important the practice of mindfulness is on our spiritual path. The Buddha taught that there are 4 foundations of mindfulness. They are mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of consciousness, and mindfulness of mental objects. I want to go over these 4 foundations only briefly in this video, but I'll put some links on my website for you to read more about these in detail if you like. In this episode, I want to focus more on why we need to train in mindfulness as opposed to concentrating on the how. So very quickly, to go over these 4 foundations of mindfulness, there is mindfulness of the body, which means being fully aware of the body. For example, when we breathe in and out when we meditate, we're mindful of whether our breath is long or short. It also means being completely aware of our physical posture and activities, such as when we're standing, sitting, lying down, bending, eating or drinking. We do these things with clear comprehension and mindfulness. In the case of mindfulness of feelings, the Buddha advises that when we experience a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling, a neutral feeling being neither pleasant nor unpleasant, that we simply remain aware that we are experiencing any one of these feelings. So we do this without any attachment to the feeling. Instead, we become basically mere observers of the presence of these feelings. In mindfulness of consciousness, this means again that we're aware if the mind is experiencing the presence of lust, hate, distraction, or ignorance, for example, as well as being aware if the mind is without these mental states. And mindfulness of mental objects refers to being mindful of the 5 hindrances, which are sensory desire, anger or ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness or worry, and doubt. So when we practice mindfulness of mental objects, we should be aware when sensory desire is in the mind, when it is not present in the mind, how it arises in our mind, for instance, what are its triggers, and how we can eradicate it from our mind. And we should also be mindful and understand why it doesn't arise in our mind in the future. And if that's not enough for you, also under mindfulness of mental objects, there's mindfulness of the 5 aggregates of clinging. For instance, we practice mindfulness of form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness, as well as mindfulness of the 6 internal and external sense bases. So there's mindfulness of the eye, ear, nose, etc. There's sense organs, sense objects, and the fetters that arise from their interaction. The second last one listed under mindfulness of mental objects is mindfulness of the 7 factors of enlightenment. And as I pointed out earlier, under the 7 factors of enlightenment, the first is mindfulness. So we practice mindfulness of our mindfulness. Can you believe it? And last but not least, there is mindfulness of the 4 Noble Truths. So there is certainly a lot we can be mindful of, isn't there? So what is the point of all this mindfulness? Why should we bother being mindful at all? It sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? Perhaps you would agree that our minds can either be our best friend or even our worst enemy. At the moment, unless we've already cultivated some mindfulness and meditation, we probably don't have much control over our thoughts and emotions. Negative thoughts seem to sneak in when we're not looking, and they start to fester and invite all their other friends, which are always only more negative thoughts. So before we know it, we have this mind full of negative thoughts, which then only leads to having unpleasant emotions such as anger. But through the practice of mindfulness, what the Buddha was trying to show us is that fortunately we're not at the mercy of our thoughts and feelings. We actually do have a choice of which thoughts we allow to linger and think about, and which we decide to let go of. Practicing mindfulness gives us the power to perceive our thoughts, these thoughts that previously went under the radar. Now, with the power of mindfulness, we can shine a spotlight on our thoughts and we can see them with more clarity. When we don't have mindfulness, our thoughts just seem to fall like this constant waterfall of thoughts, just one thought after another without any spaces between them. But with mindfulness, we will see that there are spaces between our thoughts. And perhaps more importantly, we will also be able to notice that there's a space between our thoughts and our reactions to those thoughts. You see, all of our emotions and actions, so our reactions, stem from our thoughts. For instance, if we have a negative thought, it tends to automatically give rise to a feeling of anger, and we might react physically, we might say something negative, or we might indulge in more negative thoughts. But with mindfulness, our awareness of the space between our thoughts and our reactions to them becomes greater. And the greater the space, the more time we have to choose our reaction. So it's this choice in how we react to our thoughts which gives us personal freedom and greater control, because it means we no longer have to habitually react the same way we used to. There is tremendous joy that comes the first time we're able to exercise this power of mindfulness. For instance, when the person who usually presses our button invariably presses our buttons, we can choose to react in the same impatient and irate manner, or we can choose a more calm and compassionate response and leave everyone feeling better for the rest of the day. In the book Mindfulness in Plain English, the Buddhist monk Bhante Gunaratana describes mindfulness as being like a safety net that cushions us against unwholesome actions. He pointed out that mindfulness prevents us from being swept away by our habitual reactions to people, so that we can react with wisdom rather than delusion. So we can actually transform our relationships with others simply by the power of practicing mindfulness. Now, as we begin to develop mindfulness of our thoughts, we'll notice that our thoughts come and go, like the clouds in the sky. In Buddhist teachings, the analogy often used is that our mind is naturally still, vast and spacious like the sky, and that our thoughts are like the clouds that are momentarily passing by. Now, you can see that the sky doesn't try to cling to the clouds, nor does it try to identify with them and claim ownership of them. Instead, the sky simply watches the clouds with patient awareness as they come and go, and it's neither bothered by them, nor does it, rejoice in them. So we can also develop the sky-like wisdom. We can also be like the sky and peacefully watch the cloud-like thoughts coming and going without getting attached to them. It's actually through mindfulness that we can learn to dissociate ourselves from being the thought. So what happens is that we start to see the thoughts as something separate to us, and we start to see the thoughts as things that naturally arise and fall on their own accord. So an angry thought just becomes an angry thought. It's no longer our angry thought that we have to identify with or act upon. And this is great because now we can choose whether we get involved in the thought or not. Ultimately, having this choice gives us freedom. With mindfulness, we can start to feel more in control, and we'll even win back our self-respect because we're no longer reacting habitually to our thoughts, which means we won't be doing things that we're going to later regret. In a way, mindfulness helps us to regain control of ourselves and our lives again. So previously, we might not have seen any gap between what we think and what comes out of our mouth. It might have felt that we naturally just speak our mind, but as we discover the space between our thoughts and our actions, we will recognize that we don't have to react to every little thought that comes into our mind. We will develop self-control over our body, speech and mind. And this directly helps us to avoid creating negative karma and having to suffer the negative consequences that stem from that. Overall, having mindfulness is the key to developing an awareness of our thoughts and to develop a new relationship with those thoughts. And once we have developed this insight, we will be better able to practice the 4 great efforts, which I covered in a previous episode, where we'll be able to prevent negative mental states from arising, eliminate those that have arisen, cultivate positive mental states that we're not yet experiencing, and prolong the positive mental states that have arisen. And as I mentioned in my previous video, all these 4 great efforts lead to greater happiness now and in the future. As we become more mindful of our thoughts, one of the great benefits is that it increases our compassion. Because as we notice our thoughts and our feelings arising and falling, we will see how anger, greed, and worry arise and fall, but yet out of ignorance we latch onto these and allow them to stay much longer than they naturally would have on their own accord. I mean, if we can watch our thoughts and feelings with dispassion and not get caught up in them, we will notice that these feelings cannot survive on their own without us feeding them with more thoughts or behaviours in some way. Our thoughts and feelings actually have a very short expiry date. So when we start to see how we get caught in our negative habits and we can see how we keep feeding them, slowly we'll start to develop some compassion for ourselves, because we'll notice that a lot of our suffering is of our own making. Then we'll also naturally start to extend that compassion out to others, because we'll see how others get ensnared by their own thoughts and emotions as well. So what can we do once we see a negative thought or feeling arise in our mind? The Buddha taught that the best thing for us to do is to simply watch it arise and watch it fall away, and not to feed the negative thought with more negative thoughts. For example, often our negative thoughts arise because we feel that someone has hurt us, and we feel compelled and justified in answering back or holding on to our anger. But the Buddha pointed out that brooding on these negative thoughts will never bring peace to ourselves or others. He said, "He abused me, he struck me, he overpowered me, he robbed me. Those who harbour such thoughts do not steal their hatred. He abused me, he struck me, he overpowered me, he robbed me. Those who do not harbour such thoughts steal their hatred." Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. So the Buddha is saying that whenever we give rise to angry thoughts in our mind, we shouldn't allow these thoughts to stay, and we shouldn't perpetuate them with more angry thoughts. Instead, by practicing mindfulness, we should be mindful of the angry thoughts as they arise. We should be mindful of how they generate more angry thoughts within us. And then by not identifying with these thoughts, but by merely seeing them arise and fall away, we will not feed our anger. So naturally, the first angry thoughts will have no place to stand, and they will also eventually fall away. Now, when we're dealing with feelings of anger, it's often good to look at impermanence here. In particular, the impermanence of the situation that gave rise to the angry thoughts. By seeing how everything is constantly changing, we can begin to see the futility of holding on to these past grudges, because every moment is bringing something new and fresh. So we should let the previous moments go, because they were momentary. Now granted, there might be some residue of negativity that will remain for some time, but if we don't continue to feed that negativity, it will pass on its own accord. One practice we can do when instances of anger arises is to practice mindfulness of our immediate surroundings. So we should give full attention to our present physical environment and just notice how the past negative situation doesn't exist here in the present. in any way except for in our own mind. Now, it doesn't take years to get to a stage in our practice when we can see our thoughts. The Buddha highly praised the simple practice of mindfulness of breathing, watching our breath, as being the tool that allows us to put out this fire of unwholesome thoughts whenever they arise. The Buddha said, "Monks, this concentration through mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, is both peaceful and exquisite, a refreshing and pleasant abiding that immediately disperses and allays any evil, unskillful mental qualities that have arisen. Just as when, in the last month of the hot season, a great rain cloud out of season immediately disperses and allays the dust and dirt that have been stirred up, in the same way, this concentration through mindfulness of in and out breathing, when developed and pursued, is both peaceful and exquisite, a refreshing and pleasant abiding that immediately disperses and allays any evil, unskillful mental qualities that have arisen." So by practicing mindfulness of breathing meditation, we will develop a concentrated mind that can be mindful of unwholesome and unskillful thoughts and states of mind as they arise. And this awareness will help us to disperse and allay them quickly as they arise. When we practice mindfulness, one of the things it brings to our awareness is the stories we create in our own mind. For instance, we might be happily driving along and we come across a driver who's going really slow in front of us. For many of us, this will start us thinking all sorts of negative thoughts, like, why don't they get out of my way? What are they doing on the road? Only good drivers should be on the road. I bet they're an old person. Within seconds, our mind is creating the story, which we then believe to be true. Or let's say another scenario. Perhaps our partner went to the shops to pick us up something, and when they return home, they return home empty-handed. And we immediately assume that they don't care about us, that we're not important enough to them, and then we might even get angry at them because they've been so uncaring. So in both situations, our mind has leapt to conclusions and just given rise to negative thoughts, feelings and actions. But perhaps in the first situation, the driver has just lost a loved one or has some other unimaginable suffering which is making them drive along in a daze. And in the second scenario, perhaps our partner did buy what we wanted, but they accidentally left it at the store because they were too busy talking on their phone to us because they were in a rush to get back to us. One of the most important lessons I learnt from practicing mindfulness was to not believe everything I thought. Our minds are constantly making wrong assumptions and creating stories which we then put so much energy into, only to find out that we were wrong. If we can practice mindfulness effectively, we should begin to catch ourselves when we start to create these stories. Basically, if our mind is creating stories and not seeing the people and objects as they are in front of us, then we're not practicing mindfulness. For instance, if we're out in nature and we spot a flower beside us, when we look at the flower, we usually admire the features of the flower without thinking, this flower is less beautiful than the one over there, or it would look much better if that petal was a different colour. Basically, we can observe and appreciate it for what it is and how it is. So there's no room for judgment, critiquing, or wishing for it to be different. And in the same way, if we can practice mindfulness with the people in our lives, we'll also be able to appreciate them, and their differences and idiosyncrasies won't seem something that we need to change or get rid of, but they'll be the very thing that makes that person unique and just perfect in their own way. So with mindfulness, we'll be able to let go of our craving to see and experience something different, and we can just experience everything and everyone simply as it is. And last but not least, I want to explain a very important aspect of mindfulness, and that is its relationship to concentration during meditation. Now, when we meditate on a particular meditation object, it's quite natural for our minds to be taken away and we start thinking of anything but the meditation object. But this is why we need mindfulness. We need mindfulness in order to catch the thoughts as they arise so that we can deal with them appropriately before they take us away from our object of meditation. In a previous episode, I explained how we should relate to our thoughts in meditation, but the point I want to make here is that we first need to have mindfulness in order to see our thoughts during our meditation so that we can deal with them effectively. If we cannot see our thoughts, we will simply end up daydreaming and will not be able to concentrate on our meditation object at all. So mindfulness is what allows us to notice as soon as our attention is diverted to something other than the object of meditation. Usually our attention is taken away by our thoughts, or it could be because of an external noise, for instance. Either way, it's the job of mindfulness to detect that shift in our attention, and then by detecting this, we can guide ourselves back to the object of meditation and continue meditating. Mindfulness also gives us the special ability to observe the intensity of our concentration, or perhaps lack of concentration. It is only when we have mindfulness that we can be aware of how good our concentration actually is. And during the times that we are experiencing good concentration, we should exert even more effort. So each time we realize that our concentration is going really well, we should try for short periods of increased concentration in order to help boost our powers of concentration even more. Then, as our concentration increases, our mind will become more still and our meditation will become deeper. And it is at this point that mindfulness has the job of seeing past the wave-like thoughts and into the depths of the ocean of our mind so we can discover its true nature. So all in all, mindfulness and concentration must go hand in hand for our meditations in order to bring greater peace, clarity, insight, and realization. So that's all from me for this video. I hope you are able to see that the benefits in practicing mindfulness are numerous. Mindfulness can bring us greater peace now by helping us develop a different and healthier relationship with our thoughts. And it is essential for leading us on the path to awakening and enlightenment. So if you want to see more videos, please subscribe to my channel. Please like and share this video if you found it helpful. And you can always check out more on my website, enthusiasticbuddhist.com, for more on Buddhism and meditation. So take care everyone, have a great week, and I hope to see you in the next video.